Hey, what's up, Street Talks? This is Eric from the Eric and Street Photography blog. So, I just wanted to do this quick presentation on Street Photography Composition 101. I know I made a longer video in the past. It's a little bit more in-depth and detailed, but consider this a slightly updated version of that presentation in which I try to make it a little more practical rather than theoretical, showing more examples of my own work, and based on my recent experiences, that hopefully this presentation can help you. So one of the first things I want to mention is there tends to be two things which I think make a great street photograph. Number one, obviously having a good composition, so having strong leading lines, forms, allowing the viewer to understand what's going on in the frame and how to identify the main subjects. The second thing is emotion, so having strong emotional soul, having the viewer able to sympathize or empathize with the subjects in the photograph. And I think often in street photography we tend to focus a little bit too much on composition, and just remember that composition for composition's sake is a little bit empty. A photograph without emotion and soul is a photograph that's going to be easily forgotten. One of the street photographers I highly recommend to study if you want to improve your composition in street photography is Henri Cartier-Bresson. He traditionally studied painting, drawing, and he applied these sort of theories and practical tips to his photography. My favorite photos on Cartier-Bresson aren't the ones with the most fabulous compositions, but are the ones that perfectly marry form and content or composition and emotion. So just kind of keep this on top of your mind, and hopefully you guys can learn a thing or two from this presentation. So, one of the biggest misconceptions I think when it comes to composition in street photography is that when you're going out and shooting in the streets, you can see all the lines and the diagonals and all the other compositional forms. I do believe that the more you study composition, the more you analyze your photos after you've taken them, the more you could start seeing these compositional things intuitively. One of these quotes by Henri Cartier-Bresson, which is very important, I'll read it out for you. Any geometrical analysis can be done only after the photograph has been taken, developed, and printed. Then it could be used only for a post-mortem examination. A post-mortem examination is after you've taken the photograph, that's when you could analyze it. You're not really going to have an opportunity to analyze your person or your scene while you're shooting, but there are some practical tips and tricks in which I have personally used when I'm out shooting the streets, because when you're out shooting street photography, things are happening so quickly, the light's constantly changing, there's so much action and movement in the streets, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. And of course, you have to overcome your fear of taking photos of strangers, either with permission or without permission. So on top of all of that, how can you make a good composition? A practical tip is often when you go out and shoot in the streets, just shoot from the gut. Shoot what makes sense to you, shoot what intuitively feels right. But when it comes to importing your photos into Lightroom or whatever tool you use, then when you're sitting down in front of your computer, be really, really critical and analyze your photos in terms of compositions after the fact. So I'm sure you guys had this situation where you've taken hundreds of different photos from different angles, and you're not really sure which of these photographs are your best shot. Use composition and these tools you're going to learn in this presentation to analyze your photos afterwards, whether to decide to keep the shot or ditch the shot. So these are just some very few basic compositional points, and of course this is not a 100% inclusive list, meaning if it doesn't include, if it's not in this presentation, it could still exist. But these are just some basics to get you guys started. So leading lines. Leading lines are important because they help the viewer move their eyes across the frame, and photos with leading lines, especially diagonal lines, tend to be a lot more dynamic, there's more movement, there's more energy, and the photos are a lot more vigorous. And there's different ways you could do this. So one technique is just look for leading lines, then wait for the right person to enter the scene, capture the image. Another way you could do this is when you're out shooting the street, look for interesting subjects. And once you've identified your subject, look for leading lines afterwards. For this photograph, I was out shooting in Tokyo, and often I think a good tip for getting better compositions in street photography is start with the background and wait for the subject to come afterwards. Generally, when it comes to shooting street photography, at least I know in my experience, you look for the guy with the pink afro, and then you take a photo of them quickly and just move on, and you totally disregard the background. I think by focusing first on the background, making sure you have a nice clean background with strong leading lines, and then add the subject afterwards, this could help you make a much stronger composition. And also know that the best compositions tend to be pretty simple. I do believe in minimalism, essentialism, less is more. This is a photograph I shot in Tokyo, and I see just a simple background, nice leading lines, a strong diagonal that's going through the frame, and see a guy in a suit walking by, and I just crouch down and I take one or two photos, and I just happened to get lucky with this shot. When I looked at the photo on the back of my LCD screen, I was shooting in black and white mode. I saw that his face was already quite dark, so I wanted to emphasize this afterwards in the post-processing to make him look like a totally anonymous figure. So afterwards in Lightroom, I used an adjustment brush, burned in his face or darkened his face, and I quite like the mystery, the drama, the mood of this image. And also what I try to do with this photograph is keep the man slightly a little bit to the left side of the frame, which allows more negative space for him to move to the right side of the frame. And so if you think about leading lines, there's obviously a leading line taking your eyes diagonally through the frame. And you also have some other lines here which just kind of add to the structure of the image. So yeah, essentially when you're out shooting the streets, you could also tilt your camera slightly to make stronger leading lines or stronger diagonals. Another photograph I shot in Korea quite a long time ago. It's a photograph that, once again, this is kind of the Henri Cartier-Bresson technique, or they also call this the fishing technique, where you look for a good background, look for good leading lines, and then you just wait for the right subject to enter. And the reason they call it the fishing technique is, like a good fisherman, sometimes you can sit in your boat and wait for hours and catch no fish. Other days you'll catch loads of fish. But the importance is just having patience. For this photograph, I was shooting in Korea, and this is one of the museums, and I like the vertical lines and also the leading lines. And I just waited for the right person to enter the scene. And this was just a day after it was raining heavily, so the light was pretty good. It was slightly overcast, and there's some like little leaves on the ground. From the corner of my eye, I see a lady walking into the frame, and she's wearing all white, and I thought this would be wonderful. And the second she entered the frame and I started clicking, she noticed me taking a photograph of her. So what she did was she slightly lowered her umbrella to cover her eyes. And I feel like that's what really made the photograph, because by not seeing the woman's face, it adds more mystery, it kind of gives a more open-ended, it allows the viewer to make up his or her own interpretation of who the person is behind the umbrella. So know that when you're out shooting street photography, you don't always have to be that hidden ninja where you're super stealthy. Sometimes having your subject see you taking a photograph and eliciting some sort of reaction or response can make the photograph much more interesting. But once again, if you see the leading lines, I have the subject a little bit on the left side of the frame because there's more negative space on the right side of the frame. And the reason why that's important is that visually allows the viewer to predict into the future that the subject is going to continue to move through the frame, so there tends to be a little more tension. Obviously, everything I'm talking about in this presentation, they're just kind of guidelines, not rules. There's tons of examples where you see people exiting the frame, which tends to work as well. And we'll look at an example of Henri Cartier-Bresson a little bit afterwards regarding that. Another example where you could integrate better leading lines into your photograph. So for this photo, I was just shooting during my lunch break when I had a 9-to-5 job. And that's another practical tip is, just because you have a day job doesn't mean you can't shoot to your heart's content. Often what I did was I just used 15 minutes a day to shoot during my lunch break. And some of my best shots have actually come from my lunch breaks. Anyways, there's a mall next to my workplace, and I'm going up an escalator. And I just kind of thought to myself, hey, there's some kind of nice leading lines from this escalator. Maybe if I made a photo of somebody walking in between the elevator, the escalator, the leading lines, I could make an interesting photograph. So from the right side of me, I see a guy walking into the frame. And at the time, I think I shot it with a Canon 5D, a 35 f2 lens. Just shot in P mode, which automatically chooses the aperture and shutter speed. I think ISO like 1600 to have a fast shutter speed. Just center point autofocus, nothing fancy. And the second he walks into the center of the frame, I take maybe 2 or 3 photos. Another practical tip is if you're photographing people walking, try to get their legs split like a V, which also adds 2 nice diagonal lines or a triangle. The second he steps into the center of the frame, I noticed his reflection on the right side of the frame. It wasn't actually until I went home that I saw his second reflection on the left side of the frame. But in terms of leading lines, all of the lines from the escalator point your eyes directly into the frame. And this is where I mentioned the little lines of the legs here. Nice little triangle here. And also the nice little leading lines, which kind of give the viewer focus in terms of putting your eyes directly to the center of the subject. And the reason why leading lines are also helpful is that treat leading lines, or think about leading lines as visual indicators to tell your viewer, hey buddy, this is what you should be looking at in the photograph. I think often the best street photos are the ones which have a clear subject or a clear something you should be looking at. And in terms of having subjects in your frame, if you're doing leading lines, I think generally it tends to be better to just have a single subject in the photograph because it makes it very easy for your viewer. And of course, you can make more complex compositions, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But if you're starting off in street photography, looking for the leading lines, being patient for the right person to enter, this could be a good exercise for you to start off with. And this is where I mentioned having the three different shadows. All right, to transition, this is a little bit more intermediate advanced. It's something called the golden ratio. And I'm actually not the most qualified expert to talk about this because I never went to art school or I never started painting and drawing. If you want to learn more about just the technical aspects of this, I highly recommend my buddy Adam Morelli, ADAMMARELLI. He actually went to art school, he knows all this stuff, and a lot of what I'm talking about here is what I learned from him. So there tends to be this crazy ratio in nature, 1.168 ... And it's a ratio we often see in nature. So the ways in which flowers grow, or the diameter of a seashell compared to other parts of it. And with a bunch of hocus pocus magic, and once again, don't ask me. I just know how to apply it. I don't really understand all of the things, to be honest. But with all this hocus pocus and mathematical equations, you come up with something called the Fibonacci spiral. And this is a technique that a lot of painters and a lot of people who worked on architecture in the past would often use in their work, is that they'd put this sort of grid on top of their paintings before they drew, and they drew accordingly to it. However, on the other hand, sometimes painters would just paint intuitively, and afterwards they could put this overview on their paintings or artworks and it would actually fit it correctly. So this is the important thing. This is what took me a long time to realize, is that not every single artist, photographer, or creative person is going to 100% follow the Fibonacci spiral, do it intentionally. Sometimes you find out on accident afterwards. And if anyone tells you that when they're out shooting in the street, they can see a Fibonacci spiral, I call bullshit. I think, once again, it's another tool that you could just use to examine your photos after you've shot them to get a better sense of if your photo is balanced or not. And you could see the Fibonacci spiral often in nature. So if I just kind of flip through these left and right, yep, it's kind of crazy, huh? Yep, Fibonacci spiral in nature. And also in photographs. So earlier on I talked about leading lines, having a little bit more negative space in front of the subject. Here you could see one of Cartier-Bresson's most famous images of a guy riding a bicycle. And I think the reason why this composition works, having the bicyclist exiting the frame, is because you have a very, very strong leading line of the staircase behind him. And you could see that the Fibonacci spiral fits this quite perfectly. I don't really know if Cartier-Bresson went out shooting and just thought like, hey, here's going to be a Fibonacci spiral. I think, he saw a nice composition, he walked up the stairs and just waited. He framed his photo and just waited for the right person to enter the frame. And you can see all the different leading lines and the curves through the rail, the little white line on the top of the fence. And also another key point is the man in the bicycle, the wheel is not overlapped with the fence behind him. And a way I practically apply this in my photography is often if you go to Europe or you go up staircases, you see nice little spirals. And from a lower perspective shooting up, you could find nice little Fibonacci spirals. So this photograph, I was in Marseille with my mom, staying there with Cindy for the summer. And I'm just out, and I don't remember if I photographed this on the way out or the way up. But anyways, my mom just kind of waving at me. And I just kind of looked up and I saw the spiral. And one thing I try to consciously do is put the edge of the spiral in the bottom left corner. And I essentially tilted my camera until I could accentuate this the spiral. And to be honest, I don't think this 100% fits the Fibonacci spiral. However, it's a practical way in which I integrated a spiral in my image, which just makes it much more engaging and fun. Another thing that you could think about when it comes to the golden ratio is this compositional technique. So there's a bunch of crazy math that goes into it, and I don't really want to talk about it. But anyways, if you just go on Google or go on Wikipedia, search the golden ratio, there's this equation which allows you to derive this box here. And just the thing that's important to note is if you see this little box here, the dimensions equates to the golden ratio. And if you just kind of stack these on top of each other, they fit perfectly. And the technique of the golden ratio, we'll talk about this a little bit in a minute, but as an experiment, just take out your notebook and you could draw out the golden rectangle for yourself. So start off with a square, easy. Draw a vertical line in the center. Then draw another diagonal from the bottom of the center of the square to the top right corner. And then what you do is you use the length of that line you just drew from the bottom of the square to the top right corner, and then you just essentially flatten it. So imagine that just extending that line. Then based on that, you draw another vertical line and then complete the square. And if you imagine like if you erase the line on the far left, the proportions here are equivalent to the proportions of what they call the golden rectangle, which is this here. Right? Cool. Then after that, you draw a diagonal line from the bottom left corner to the top right corner. And then with that new little mini rectangle on the right side, from the top left corner of that, you draw another line to the bottom right corner. And you could see kind of that point which intersects in the red lines. That is a focus point where your eyes will tend to be drawn to. And if you talk about, and they call that the golden triangle, right? And so often when I'm out shooting in the streets, the way I'm able to apply this concept of the golden triangle is just try not to center your subjects too much. And when it comes to photographing different elements, try to put it slightly off frame. If you also notice, the intersection points of the golden triangle is quite similar to the rule of thirds. And also what I prefer about the golden triangle, think about the golden triangle versus the rule of thirds, is that the rule of thirds is more focused on horizontals and vertical lines, whereas the golden triangle is more focused on diagonal lines. So it's also another reminder to just add more diagonals into your photograph, because diagonals tend to have a lot more energy, they're a lot more dynamic than just horizontal and vertical lines. All right, so in terms of how to draw the golden triangle, very simple. Imagine this little box here is your viewfinder. You just draw a line from the top left to the bottom right corner. It could be vice versa as well. And then what you do is you draw another line from the bottom left corner to the top. And the key is you want to make this perpendicular. So there should be a 90-degree angle. For those of you guys who remember trigonometry class, 90-degree angles all between here. And 90 plus 90 plus 90 makes 360. And essentially that little intersecting point in between the lines, that's where your eye tends to be drawn to. You could also do this on the other side. Draw the line from the top right corner to perpendicular to that initial diagonal line you made. Other way you could do it is from the top right corner to the bottom left corner. Then you could continue drawing another line from the bottom right corner to the top. Once again, that should be perpendicular, 90-degree angles all around. And then you could do it the other way as well. And if you start to connect these lines, you kind of get this crazy little pentagram, little devil sign. I just kind of joke around with it. And I actually know some photographers who will draw these things on the back of their LCD screen and use that as a tool for composition. Yeah, I think it's a good idea. It's a good reminder that you should just put diagonals and stuff like that in your compositions. And some of you guys might be watching this and you're like really skeptical. You're like, really, Eric? You're telling us about this compositional technique that you don't really understand and you're still kind of showing it to us. Like, what's the deal? One of the things I believe in is just because you don't 100% understand how something works doesn't mean that it doesn't work. So for example, I know that if I do a lot of push-ups or a lot of chin-ups and eat a lot of meat, my muscles are going to get bigger. And that is proven. However, in terms of the biology, how the mechanisms work within my system, whether that's hormonal changes or micro-tearing of muscles, that's a theory I don't really understand. But at the end of the day, I tend to be a practitioner rather than a theorist. So consider me also the same as you, is I'm not 100% sure how all this theoretical stuff works, but it just tends to work. And I'll just kind of give you guys an example. So this is a photograph I shot in Berlin, and I wasn't thinking about triangles or diagonals, golden rectangles, or the golden triangles, whatnot. However, when I was just shooting from the gut. And I took a bunch of photos of him, maybe 20 or so images. And eventually I just kind of settled on this photograph because it just felt balanced. And that's what these compositional tools will teach you, is how to achieve balance and harmony in your frame. And if I put the golden the golden triangle on top of my photographs, you could see it kind of fits decently well. I drew a line from the top left corner to the bottom right corner, then drew the perpendicular line there, and it kind of draws you towards his eye. Then another diagonal here, and yeah, it just kind of fits. I mean, of course, not 100% perfectly, but life never does. And if I drew another diagonal this way, it kind of draws your eyes to the beer. Of course, not 100% perfect. And then also adds some balance here. And if I drew all the other crazy stuff here, it doesn't fit 100% correctly, but for me, it feels quite balanced. And a way you could do this in Lightroom, which is actually really cool, is, let's say you open up Lightroom. There's different grid overlay tools in Lightroom. By default, it's set to the rule of thirds. You could also turn that into the golden spiral, the Fibonacci spiral, the golden triangle, and so forth. So let's see. So let's just go to a series that I photographed. So let's say this photograph. Okay. So the way to do this is you could either go to develop. Hotkey for develop is D. And then you essentially want to open up the crop tool. And you know what the crop tool is. You can either click this little thing here, left click that, or the hotkey for crop is R, right? So by default, and I'm pressing O to scroll through these, by default it's according to the rule of thirds. And so you could see like his eye is kind of in this corner, it feels relatively balanced, whatever. The cool thing at Lightroom, what you can do is press the hotkey O, and it'll actually scroll through all these different overlays. And I have no idea what some of these things are, but the ones I do know are the golden triangle here. And this is actually very important to know. While holding Shift, press O, it'll change the orientation of it. So if I put the golden triangle here, what I like about it is, yeah, like it fits it pretty well. And of course his eye is not 100% in that corner here. So, some photographers, what they might do, make sure this is locked here, is they might just crop this in a little bit tighter to make sure his eye is more or less perfectly in that corner there. And perhaps that might be a much more dynamic, interesting composition. But for me, my general rule is I just don't like to crop images too much because it makes me a lazy photographer. So even though my compositions aren't 100% perfect, I deal with the imperfections. So if I go back into the crop tool, you could also see the Fibonacci spiral through here. And by pressing Shift and O, you could change the orientation of these spirals to go into different corners. And once again, these are all different tools you could use to examine your photographs after you shot them. They're not really tools you could use when you're out shooting. So if you're that one photographer who figures out how to draw a Fibonacci spiral on the back of your LCD screen, all the power to you. But for me, I just kind of use, in practicality, I only use the golden triangle tool. Golden triangle tool to determine my compositions after I've shot them. Also, the cool thing is on my Ricoh GR camera, there's a crop mode, or there's a grid overlay mode on the back of my camera, which just adds a bunch of diagonals to the back of my frame. So when I'm out shooting, it's just a nice little reminder to say, hey, Eric, try to add more diagonals to your composition. Okay, moving forward. All right, so this is another photograph I shot in downtown LA. So saw this cool guy in the streets, stopped him. I said, hey, bro, I love your tattoos. Do you mind if I made a portrait of you? He said, yeah, sure. And it was a really bright day in the middle of the day. And what I just did was I asked him to stand in the middle of the sun. And I set my camera to P mode, ISO 1600, and I just lower the exposure by maybe 1 2/3. And what that does is his skin is well lit, but the background is totally black. And I think in terms of post-processing, I just boosted the blacks and added contrast, so it turns the background totally dark. But anyways, when I'm shooting this, I'm just shooting with intuition, my gut, and what feels right. But if you apply the golden triangle after the fact, you can see it kind of fits pretty well actually. And you could see the diagonal composition of his neck. And it's not something I really thought of intuitively when I was shooting it, but it's just kind of a nice reminder that, hey, this composition has nice balance and it works. Another example, a portrait I shot of Cindy. So we're just having dinner and there was just a nice little spotlight above her. And I just started to snap a bunch of photos of her. And, you know, the photos are quite blurred because she's moving around a lot. But one thing I love about the photograph is I love the emotion, the mood in her face. I like the blur, the motion. I like how her hands are coming out from the edges of the frame in the bottom left corner and the bottom right corner. And you can kind of see, if I added the golden triangle, her eye just kind of fits that corner there. Similar, another photograph I shot in London. A guy in a suit eating a french fry. The loneliest man alive. And you can see I put his head in the top right corner. And it kind of more or less perfectly fits the golden triangle. Another photograph I shot in Tokyo. Saw this guy in a suit looking sad and lonely. I love that little streak of light in front of him. So I moved in front of him, shot 2 photos really quickly vertically, and then he just moved away. But once again, you could kind of see his head or his face or his eyes is kind of placed in the top left corner. So when you're out shooting street photography, once again, you're not really going to see these things here, but as a practical tip, just try not to center your frame, add more diagonals into your compositions. All right, so moving forward, layers. So layers have been quite popular nowadays, of course in the past as well, but one photographer to definitely study if you want to add more complexity to your images is Alex Webb. His technique is he adds as many things into the frame and tries to take a more maximalist approach. And layers, to be honest, is not really a technique that I use a lot in my photography. I know how to do it, but for me, I just tend to prefer more simple images. And the photographer I admire the most in terms of composition is probably Joseph Kudelka. His photos tend to be much more simple and minimalist. And if I showed you guys, let's see, Eric Kim Kudelka. So one photographer I really love is Joseph Kudelka, and his photos just black and white, simple compositions. This one's actually a little more complex, like the diagonals here, the shadow, the man here, the hat, woman in the bottom right corner, kid looking over. That to me is the cherry on top, that nice little detail here, the nice between the blacks and the grays. But anyways, that's a little more complex. But his compositions tend to be a lot more simple, a lot more minimalist. Let's see which one, very simple. Let's see, nice little triangle composition here, one of my favorites. Let's see, where's my favorite shot? Where's his dog shot? Oh, there it is. Yeah, so this is actually one of my favorite compositions. A black subject against a white background. These little triangles here, which look like the dog's ears. Apparently my friend's actually been to this park. But anyways, you just know that you don't need crazy compositions to make a good photograph. But to transition, so talking about layers. So this is an example of a photograph by Alex Webb. So you can see all the different layers in the photograph, from the kid in the foreground with the spinning the ball that looks like a globe in his finger. Love all the blues that are going through the frame. How all the kids are spaced equally distant apart. And you can see that there's kids really close to you and really far away. And the good thing about depth is it allows the viewer to have room for their eyes to travel throughout the frame. And the cherry on top, which is a small detail, which I think makes a good photograph, a really great photograph, is in the top left corner. He shot the photos the second that the person actually shot the basketball inside the hoop. So these are small little details that most people won't know, but something that photographers love to see. Another photograph that I love is how you can see the couple on the far right side of the frame, on the left side of the frame, the nice little arc in the center of the frame, and then the cherry on top is, of course, the silhouette of the father and I think the daughter in the center of the frame. And the nice thing about layers is that you could create lots of different little mini stories. So in this photograph, for example, on the right side of the frame, you just see this couple, looks like they're in love or engaged in some sort of romantic way. The man on the left, who is having none of it, he just wants to cover his face and get out of the frame. And then you can see the tender moment between a father and a daughter. Another thing to know is when it comes to photographing layers or multiple subjects, the golden number tends to be 3, is having either 3 pairs or 3 subjects kind of equidistant in the frame. And the basic way you could do this is put a subject on the left side of the frame, on the right side of the frame, and one smack dab in the center. And what this does is it achieves balance and unity in the frame. This is an example where I added layers into my frame. I was out shooting in downtown LA, and out of nowhere, this huge flash mob comes out of nowhere. And I'm there shooting with a film like a 35mm lens and Kodak Portra 400. And I think I was at f8, shooting at like 500th of a second or 1,000th of a second. And while they're coming straight at me, I'm kind of getting into the frame and shooting head on. So you could see how there's different layers in the frame. You got the lady on the far left of the frame. You have the men in the center of the frame with the LA hat with a hand gesture. And you also have another lady in the bottom right corner with a hat. Her face is totally obscured. And not the best example of layers, but just an example of a photograph that I've made. So when it comes to shooting layers, there are different ways you could do it. You could start off by seeing a good scene where there's a lot of things happening. Let's say an Alex Webb's photograph where you see different subjects, which I like to call anchor subjects, subjects who aren't moving in the frame. So, those all the kids hanging out in the background, looks like they're not really moving so much. Once you've identified different anchor subjects, subjects that aren't moving, and then see how you could add other elements into the frame. Either you wait for other kids to run into the frame or other kids to start playing and get in there. A key tip is when you're working on layers, don't focus on what's closest to you in the foreground. Focus on what's furthest away in the background. And the benefit of this is that it'll give the viewers an illusion of depth because the more things that are focused in the background will allow the viewer's eyes to travel through the frame. And this is another example of a photograph that I shot. And you can see I pre-focused it to about 5 meters. And you can see this some sort of interaction between the woman in the center and the man on the left. And what I try to do is wait until someone's face came really, really close to me. And you could kind of see the intensity of the depth in this photograph. And they also call this the bookend technique, where you have one subject's face or body limb or whatever taking entire part of the image. And what it does is it just kind of compacts the frame and adds more energy and focus to whatever is in the background. Another example, a photograph I shot of Cindy in our apartment. So we're just kind of getting ready to have dinner or something. And we have this nice little mirror in our apartment. And what I did was I focused it to the distance about 3 meters to her in the mirror. And I shot over her shoulder to have her in the foreground. And once again, this kind of gives you an illusion of depth. And if I didn't have a shadow outline of her on the left side of the frame, I feel like the photo wouldn't be as balanced or engaging. And once again, you could see how there's no white space in the left side of the frame, how I made her body fill up the entire left side, which is called a bookend. Another example of a photograph that I shot is shot this when Cindy was doing dress shopping before our wedding, and used a flash, and I was shooting through a mirror. So she was looking towards me, but I'm actually focused on the mirror behind her. And you can see her face is slightly out of focus, and I like that because it allows the viewer to travel their eyes through the frame and adds more depth. Triangles. So this is one of the last things I want to talk about. And triangles are a simple compositional technique which add more balance and symmetry to the frame. And there's lots of different ways you could do this. So this is an example by Alex Webb, one of my favorite photographs. To start off, I just love the magenta of the sky against the green in the bottom right corner. And I just love how the way that there's also depth in this photograph. So you have the kids in the right side of the frame, which are closest to you. Then you have the ladies in the bottom left corner, which are a little bit further away than the guy in the top left corner, who's really, really far away. And you can see that when it comes to triangles, it's not going to be like a perfect equilateral triangle every single time. But the way I see it is triangles are just a good way to proportion the frame and just to add some balance to the frame. Another example by photographer Joseph Kudelka. And also know that when you're out shooting, you could arrange these things too. Like this is a photograph by Kudelka, and this is part of his Gypsies project. And I really, really doubt he just found 3 kids perfectly outlined as a triangle, all flexing and showing the ribs. He was probably talking to them. It's like, hey, kids, show me your muscles or look tough. And he actually probably asked them to move in that sort of type of way. And so you can see all their faces are triangles. And if you guys are even more savvy, you can see there's more triangles in the rib cages, in between their arms. And I think that it just makes for a fantastic photograph. Last example, this is a photograph that I personally shot. And I'm shooting this in Mumbai, India. I'm out shooting with my buddy Kaushal Parikh, also known as KP, one of my favorite street photographers from India. And yeah, we're just out shooting. See a kid in the bottom left corner just chilling, his granddad or something in the right side of the frame. And this, I'm not 100% sure still if that's a deity or some sort of political figure in the top of the frame. And I just kind of like it as, you got a kid in the bottom left corner, someone who's older, and then a painting in the top of the frame. So I just thought that would be a nice little triangle composition, and then you have the little tiger in the center of the frame. So you see that kind of adds a nice little triangle. So sometimes when you're out shooting, you actually will see the triangles. The tricky thing is, if you go out and shoot saying, I must shoot triangles, I must shoot triangles, sometimes this could obstruct your vision to taking other great photographs. But if you're purely doing this as a compositional exercise, yeah, I would say go out and just make triangles your focus for the day. To think, I'm going to put a subject on the left side of the frame, bottom left side of the frame, bottom right side of the frame, the top of the frame, and see how you could continue to add or subtract elements to achieve a triangle composition. Or sometimes you just shoot instinctively, and then you'll discover triangles after the fact, which is fine too, because a lot of street photography is serendipity, is chance, but the more you go out and shoot, the more lucky you're going to get. Another example where you could add triangles into your photograph. So in this photograph, I shot this with a flash, downtown LA. See this guy on a cool lowrider bike, and I just crouched down from a low angle and shot a few photos of him, and he was pretty cool with it. But anyways, I didn't notice this when I was shooting, but I kind of had the concept I wanted to get the handlebars into the frame. And you could just kind of see, it just kind of adds for a nice little compositional technique. And I think it just adds much more dynamic elements to the image. Another example of how there's a triangle composition in the frame after I've shot it. So I'm out shooting downtown LA, no, not downtown LA, Hollywood. Shot this with my Canon 5D 24mm lens, shot with a flash. And I see a lady in this wonderful hat, crouched down, took a photo. And the second before I take a photo, she notices me about to take a photo. So she kind of gives me the jazz hands. And what I notice after the fact is, because she has an interesting hand gesture and just kind of sticking out her hands, it kind of creates a nice composition of a triangle with her face and her hands, and also like the two guys on the left and right side of them. So these are just 3 quick compositional techniques you guys could use in your street photography: leading lines, layers, and triangles. For me, I like to kind of keep it simple. So if you want to improve your compositions in street photography, either think of these photos and apply them to your photos while you're studying them, post-mortem after the fact, like Cartier-Bresson suggested, or choose one of these techniques and just go out for an entire day and just try to focus on that. So whether that be leading lines, find a leading line somewhere in public, wait for the right people to enter the scene and make it, or whether it comes to capturing layers, so trying to add more people in the foreground, middle ground, and background. Remember to pre-focus to whoever is furthest away in the background, and also shoot with a deep depth of field, so sticking your aperture in between f8 and f16, keeping your aperture your shutter speed pretty high by shooting with a high ISO like 1600. And the last thing, triangles, whether that be capturing multiple subjects or creating triangles with people's hands and so forth. Also, I find that you'll find more triangles if you crouch down very low and shoot from those lower perspectives. So quick compositional techniques you guys could use to kickstart your creativity. And once again, you're not always going to see this when you're shooting, but know how to spot it after the fact. So this is it for today. I'm going to drink some more coffee. I'm going to go to the beach with Cindy, chill out. And until next time, peace out.